is going on. You feel it, don't you? Change, revelation, apocalypse, something sliding away. The story is getting stronger, and many, like us, are reading this story. But who is writing it? Are we? Something else? Someone else. It's a story that has happened before, and it will happen again. But it always begins the same way. A procession of the damned. By the damned I mean the excluded. We shall have a procession of data that science has excluded. Battalions of the accursed, captained by pallid data that I have exhumed, will march. You'll read them, or they'll march. I'm Douglas Batchelor, and you're listening to What Magic Is This? What a year. I feel I need to let you in on something. So, for the next 2 months, I'm going to be talking to a lot of individuals that have meant a great deal to me through their work and their ideas, and I think that it's going to be a somewhat special closeout to 2020. So, as much as this is going to be a bit of a gift to me, I want it to be a gift to the listeners as well. There's not going to be a ton of episodes where I just sit and talk about a topic with another person. There's going to be a lot of me talking to people that are very important to me. So with that, I have to start with somebody first, though. And this is going to be a show where it's just me talking. There's no guest. But I feel that with this individual, I have to tackle it on my own because they've meant a great deal to me. So this is going to be a return to the Fool's Gallery. We haven't really done one of these in a little bit, quite a while actually, not since Swedenborg. I feel that this is a person who needs to be considered as far as someone who has added their own special take on the occult or the supernatural or the paranormal or even magic. But this guy is more so much about the supernatural or the paranormal, although he was not a fan of either term. Now, the person I'm going to talk about, they have been on the topic list for probably longer than anybody. It used to be Emanuel Swedenborg, who was on there for a long period of time, but Charles Fort was not too far behind him, and eventually Charles became the one who was just on the list for forever. And none of the people that I gave the topic list to considered him. They never brought him up. He's like, oh, maybe I might want to talk about this person. That's perplexing to me. Maybe they think that somehow he's easy to talk about because he's about weird stuff. Anyways, the individual that I'm going to be talking about today is a big hero of mine by the name of Charles Fort. Here's the thing. Before Carl Jung, before Hermann Hesse, before Robert Anton Wilson, I had Charles Fort. He is pretty much the spark that started all of this in a way. So to keep the theme of stories going with this episode, I'm going to tell one. So this is another, Baby Doug story. I lived out in the country, and I had to go to a rural school, which means that I had to take a somewhat long bus ride. The school was maybe about 20 minutes outside of Calgary, Alberta, but the bus ride would maybe take me about an hour to an hour and a half to get to school. An hour and a half there, an hour and a half back. It was a lot of time to be had spending going on the bus. I'm not trying to tell this to garner any kind of sympathy or anything like that, but I kept to myself for the most part during school. It wasn't that I was unpopular. I tended to be better when I was on my own. Anytime that there were, say, lunch breaks or any free time, I would spend it in the libraries of the schools that I would attend. I know that doesn't come as a surprise to anybody, but there it is. So I would try to look for books that were interesting to me. And so the way that the library in the middle school that I went to, it was called Springbank Middle School, I don't think they really went out of their way to buy books. I think most of their book collection came from people donating books to them. Either just they got tired of these books and just wanted to give them, here you go, or maybe they passed away. I mean, there'd been a community there for quite some time. Now, the reason that I bring this up is that there must have been a weirdo in the area, somebody who had a collection of books on the things that I'm interested in. We did have in that library quite a few books that were about UFOs and ghosts, and I don't know if people remember those black books. I think it was put out by Time Warner. It was things about the unexplained in each book. I mean, there'd be one on telepathy, there'd be one on like cryptids. Anyways, I hope people know what I'm talking about there. But my middle school library had these books, and they had quite a good selection of the stuff that I was really interested in. Now, the way that I would go about picking books from this library it was only by a title, and if the book had an interesting title, I would usually pick it up and try to give it a read. This is around the time when I discovered The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. The title looked interesting to me, and that's basically where I got my love for William Blake, was in this library from that book, just the title, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. It seemed interesting to me. But there was a book there that had an interesting title because it had a swear in the title, and that was The Book of the Damned. So I checked this book out. I took it home with me. I really didn't know what was inside the book. Interesting title. Here we go. There it is. So again, the long bus rides to and from school, I would just read this book, The Book of the Damned by Charles Fort. I'd love to say that I got it immediately and loved it. I mean, I was maybe, I guess, like 11 at the time, 11 or 12 years old at the time, in grade 5. But I certainly did not get what was happening with this book. It was a very odd book. It was very, it was all over the place. But I kept checking it out over and over again. It just stayed with me. It was like, oh, maybe I should get this book out again and give it another read, or at least try to read it. But I did this over and over again over the next 3 years while I was in this school before I eventually had to be moved to a different school because of my terrible grades and some bullying. Anyways, it doesn't matter. Now, I was always interested in other books with similar content, things like ghosts and UFOs. That started before I discovered Book of the Damned, but eventually, because of this book, I started to look more and more. I became a bit obsessed with these kind of topics. And eventually, through the years, I got more books by Charles Fort, his other work, and I would just find more books with similar content. Charles Fort has always been around somewhat constantly in my life, and there's something about his ideas, not so much the details of the odd phenomena, but the way that he comes at thinking about the world. So, could I say that it's all Charles Fort's fault? Not really, but he did have a hand in it. So I know in my Colin Wilson episode, I said Colin Wilson might be the patron saint of What Magic Is This podcast, and I had to kind of think about that a little bit. Is it Charles Fort, the patron saint? Not like it really matters in any way, shape, or form. Actually, it's kind of funny because Colin Wilson, he did not like Charles Fort one bit. He called him a crank and atrocious and unreadable, which I think is a bit of a shame, truthfully, because they're very similar in some respects. I just think that, well, maybe I'll put it a way that Colin would have liked. We'll bring in some brain hemispherics here. Colin writes like the left hemisphere of the brain. He's very detail-oriented, and his books are about certain instances, but I guess they're about big ideas, of course, but he's more about the details. Whereas Charles, he's more right hemisphere. He thinks of the big idea. He'll talk about it, and it'll be somewhat poetic. He's far more poetic than Colin Wilson, who is poetic himself, but I think Charles has a way with words. Anyways, who's to say? Colin, Charles, who's the patron saint, it doesn't really matter. But Chuck Fort, though, he was before Colin. He was pretty much before anybody. So with that, who is Charles Fort? He was an American writer and researcher. He would research anomalous phenomena and odd observances of reality, or what we call reality. He mainly wrote in between the beginning of the 20th century, so 1900 to about 1932 or so. He was influential in his time, for sure, definitely. I'd like to say that his influence has grown, but I don't know if that's the best way of putting it. He's always been one of those guys who's just been around. People are aware of Charles Fort. He's a monument. Perhaps not the greatest monument, but he is definitely one of those people like, oh yes, you can't forget about Charles Fort. His work has never been out of print. Since it's been published, he has always been published, which is an accomplishment, truthfully. He has a word that is attributed to him. It's called Fortean. Fortean, basically, I'll talk about it in a little bit. It just basically means supernatural or paranormal. Some could say that he is the spiritual successor of Robert Kirk, somebody who wrote the book The Secret Commonwealth, which is worth checking out if you haven't yet. The Secret Commonwealth is about folklore and fairies and all of that fun stuff, but I believe it was written in the 17th century. Charles Fort has been inspirational to many, myself included. He's got a very idiosyncratic mind, which I would venture to proclaim he was a genius in his own way. Certainly. I think I can go as far as to call him a bit of a genius. He has 4 books. They are The Book of the Damned, which is his most well-known book. He wrote a book called New Lands, Lo, and Wild Talents. To me, he is a man who wrote the future and continues to write it. When, as much as that sounds like a lofty proclamation, stick around. But I think with this episode, what I really want to try and accomplish here, because he seems like a figure that people are just like, oh, okay, that's interesting, and then they can move on. I say no. I say it's about time we put some respect on his name. Let's talk about the life of Charles Hoy Fort. He lived a somewhat prosaic life, I would say. Charles Hoy Fort was born in Albany, New York in 1874. His parents were of Dutch ancestry. His family was somewhat wealthy. His father owned a grocer's in New York, and he was the eldest child, so there were some expectations of him. His nickname when he was younger was Toddy, which is a little bit fun. His mother, Agnes Hoy, she developed an infection from Charles's youngest brother when he was born, and when Charles was 4 years old, his mother passed away. She was only 24 years old. His father was named Charles Nelson Fort. I don't want this to be triggering, but I will just say this. Charles Fort's father, authoritarian doesn't come close. He was a very brutal man. He was known for somewhat violent outbursts. He had, rules around the house. There was a strict no talking policy when they would eat dinner. He had servants that would tend to take care of the boys, and some of these were very close to Charles and his brothers, but when he was around, he was one of those figures to be feared, certainly. There's a story in Charles's autobiography, which he never published. It was called Many Parts, about how his father would try and teach him words, and because he was younger, he had a hard time with some words to be able to enunciate properly. So his father would say this word, and then Charles would try to say it, and every time that he didn't say it properly because his mouth couldn't form the proper structure to make the word sound, his father would punch him in the face until he got it right. So that's kind of how Charles grew up. Charles and his brothers, I believe he had 2 other brothers, they would, at many points, they would fantasize about violence towards their father. Now, there's a really good biography called Charles Fort, the Man Who Invented the Supernatural, by stage magician Jim Steinmeier. The most striking parts of the book, for me, are of Charles Fort and his father, and the role that his father played in Charles's life. It's a fairly good biography. I would certainly suggest reading it if Charles Fort is interesting to you. But Charles's father instilled a distrust of authority within Charles, certainly. I mean, there's no 2 ways about it. Again, Charles had a couple of brothers. Charles was the eldest, so he would attempt to protect his brothers as much as he could. As a young adult, Charles wanted to be a naturalist. He would collect shells and plants, and he would study them. So he showed curiosity and intelligence from a somewhat early age, but he wasn't a very good student. He didn't do well in school. Charles always seemed to be in his own world. He was an autodidact, so he would learn things on his own. He would read constantly. So this is a little bit familiar, at least to me it is. When he finished school, he tried to attempt getting jobs at newspapers, and he had tried to attempt to write. Tension with his father eventually boiled over, and he moved himself out of the house that he grew up in, and he moved in with his maternal grandfather. That didn't last too long. Wanderlust and adventure became something for him. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to experience something different. So at the age of 18, he said that he wanted to travel, and he did. In and around this time, you can actually see a picture of Charles Fort, and it's the most notorious picture of Charles that will come up. It shows somebody who looks like pretty much a larger, more rotund Teddy Roosevelt with the kind of walrus mustache and the spectacles. People don't realize, I think he was only 19 at the time when this photo was taken. Now, he looks much older than he actually was. I guess people just grew up a little bit faster back in the day. So yes, Charles did travel. I believe he traveled across America. He eventually found his way to England and to Europe and also to Africa. It was while he was in southern Africa that he fell very ill, and he had to cut his travels short, so he moved back to New York. A childhood friend by the name of Anna Filing, she helped Fort get healthy again. And the two hit it off quite well. I mean, they'd known each other for a long period of time, but eventually they married, and that was in 1896. Anna was 4 years older than Charles. She was not a fan of books. She wasn't a ravenous reader like Charles was, but she enjoyed films, and she enjoyed parakeets. They always had parakeets, and Charles and her would go to films quite a bit together. They moved around as they had to. They lived a somewhat poor existence, and Charles was a very frugal person. He was trying to make a living as a writer, basically, and they would hit on fairly hard times. And Charles would get very down on himself, which was a habit that continued for the rest of his life. In 1906, he started to collect rather strange stories of phenomena that would occur around the world. He gave himself a bit of a starting point. He only collected information after 1800 just because the amount of information that he could collect, there was tons of it. There was tons of stories of very strange things happening all over the world. Eventually, a couple of inheritances helped him with his poverty, and yes, he was able to, in some way, write full-time. He was skeptical of science, ultimately, but his research did continue, as did his writing. This culminated in two novels, one called X and Y, as well as another manuscript that was published before that, and I forget what it was called. Anyways, doesn't come to mind. But he also tried to sell stories to magazines and to newspapers as well. It was while he was shopping around these stories that it caught the attention of one Theodore Dreiser. Now, Theodore Dreiser is an interesting character on his own, worth looking into a little bit, but he tried publishing a book that he would be known for called Sister Carrie, but it was scuttled as people felt that it was a bit too risque. Eventually, Theodore Dreiser, he thought that his career was ruined, and he became the editor of a publishing company when he came across one of Fort's writings, and he fell in love almost immediately. They became lifelong friends, actually, and Theodore was very important in trying to encourage Charles in every way. He loved Charles's Fort X, and he loved Charles's Fort's novel Y. X is it is about Martians controlling us, and these Martians, they live in the sky. Y is about some unknown beings that exist in the South Pole or in Antarctica. I'm not sure that we would have known of Charles Fort if it was not for Theodore Dreiser. He was that important to Charles and getting Charles published. Charles became frustrated with not being able to get his novel published. He still collected weird information. He had this very interesting filing system in his biography by Jim Steinmeier. It goes into it, but he had an interesting way of shoeboxes and a filing system that is quite unique to him. There's one story of him, because he just collected so much information of him at one point, just with, I think, a bunch of cards sitting on a park bench, and the wind picks up at one point, and him feeling somewhat down on himself. Charles Fort just let go of the information in the cards that he had in his hand, and he just let the wind take them. This was an ongoing thing in Charles's life. At some point, he actually burned his manuscripts, X and Y, much to the dismay of Theodore Dreiser. But Charles Fort, he just did as he did, and he shrugged, and he started work on a new book, which was called Z, which would become the Book of the Damned. Now, Dreiser's reputation was repaired at some point, so he went to bat for the Book of the Damned with his publisher, Liveright. The publisher basically told Dreiser that, hey man, we can't publish this book. If we do, we're going to lose money on it. And Dreiser basically, he stood up to them and said, look, either you publish this book or you're going to lose me. I'll take my books and my work to a different publisher. So either you publish Book of the Damned or I'm done. I'm out of here. I'm gone. So in that way, Book of the Damned was published, and it was successful. People did indeed like it, or some people really loved it. Some people just like, I don't know what to make of this. But it became a bit of a thing in its time. Charles inherited some more family money, and in 1924 to about 1926, Charles and Anna, they moved to London, and it basically was for one reason alone, to be able to go to the British Museum and continue his research. The rest of his life was basically just publishing his books and going from his apartment by subway to the New York Public Library. He would just spend hours there. It's another interesting story of how Charles, when he published the Book of the Damned, he was in the New York Public Library, and he asked them, hey, do you have this book? And they were like, oh, yes, sure. It's over here in the strange literature section. And he was a bit dismayed because he thought he was doing some somewhat serious work, but he just kind of went with it. He lived a quiet life. He was somewhat boring, but several odd paranormal instances happened to him. But once you open that door, it's really tough to close. So Charles would just kind of do his own thing. He would have friends over, and he would drink beer with them. He loved beer. If you look at him, he looks like a beer guy. There was a bit of a cult following that surrounded him. In a way, because he was idiosyncratic. He could only be himself. He had a ton of health problems. His skepticism from science and authority figures basically meant that he ignored a lot of his health problems, specifically eyesight. He had really bad eyes, which didn't help with writing at all in any way. But he still tried to continue to write. On May 3rd, 1932, Charles Fort, he collapsed and he was brought to a hospital. Most likely it was because he had leukemia, but a publisher brought an advanced copy of his last book, Wild Talents, for him to hold, and Charles got to hold it, and then he died a few hours later. In one of his more notorious obituaries, Charles Fort was called the foe of science. That's pretty cool. His notes were eventually donated to the New York Public Library, so in a way, his knowledge came home, which I think is quite lovely. So let's talk about some of Charles's books. Let's start with the Book of the Damned, which was published in 1919. It is by far his most notorious book. I think it's great. It's wonderful. There's phenomena, UFOs before they were actually called UFOs, lights in the sky before Krakatoa, which people said, there was these weird lights in the sky, and scientists said that was only because of Krakatoa. And Charles Fort was like, no, this kind of stuff happened way before Krakatoa. Sorry, everybody. And sorry, science. There's things falling from the sky in this book, disappearing people, Fort's theories, and some of his ideas in there. So Book of the Damned is well worth a read. His second book, called New Lands, was published in 1923. It's mostly about anomalies, and in this book he actually talks about something called the Super Sargasso Sea, which is a place that exists almost like a parallel dimension, but it exists in the sky above everything, and weird things manifest there, and they can fall to Earth and that kind of fun stuff. He did not find astronomy very interesting, which I think is a bit of a mistake for him. I think he would have got a lot from it. I don't think this is a very good book. It's definitely his least popular book by all standards. Pretty much everybody's in agreement with this. It's just not for a second act after Book of the Damned, it just doesn't read very well. It's less fun. It's very serious. It takes itself way too seriously. Yeah, it's just kind of his attempt to be taken seriously. Maybe that New York Library thing it hurt a little bit more than he would like to think. But it's also, in a way, it's his most outlandish book. In 1931, he published Lo, L-O. It's kind of Book of the Damned Part 2. Lo is where we see things come together for Charles. It is more ordered. It is a very tight book. In this one, he has a lot of anger at science. He scoffs at things like Einstein's relativity. He wasn't a fan of Einstein's relativity, and a lot of people nowadays make something of this. This guy didn't believe in relativity. What an idiot. And it's just like, calm down, everybody, really. I think that this book, because of its skepticism of science, should be called So, but that's just me. I would say, if there is the first book that one should read of Charles Ford's, I would say start with Lo. It is very approachable, and it is a wonderful book. It's probably Charles's most well-ordered, rounded book. So yes, I'll just put that out there. In 1932, again, the year that he died, he published Wild Talents. And this is my favorite book of Charles's. He talks a lot about psychic powers and witchcraft. This is a book that I think that reads like a dream. I really enjoy this book. And he talks about the fact that somehow we might have had special powers that we've just maybe lost over time, or they weren't useful to us, and maybe some of these psychic powers come back in some way, or maybe that we can make them come back. Anyways, it's an interesting read. So I just want to talk for a second here about his writing style. You won't read anything quite like Charles Fort. I mean, I would try to compare him to somebody, but there really isn't anybody that writes like him. Charles can't help but write like Charles Fort. He's also fairly funny. Some of his quips are very tongue-in-cheek and quite funny. Yeah, I actually have laughed out loud. I lolled reading Charles Fort's books. When I was younger, I had no idea what he was talking about, but as I've aged and come back to read his material, it is very fun. I think he should be known as being a bit more of a writer than just somebody who collects weird data. So, what kind of guy was Charles Hoy Fort? Well, Steinmeier's biography paints a pretty interesting picture of him. I'm going to start with the outward appearance of Charles. He seemed a quiet man, somewhat gentle, carefree in a way, very frugal because he had to be. He definitely loved his wife, Anna, yes, and he was also a very loyal friend. He had a bit of a dark side. He didn't think very much of himself, and some of this would carry out into the way that he presented himself and he carried himself, being somewhat quiet and a bit of a loner. I don't think he defended his ideas as much as people would probably think. He wasn't, well, this is up for debate, but I really don't see him as being like a firebrand in any way, shape, or form. He thought a lot of his ideas were just like really quite funny. And there's one passage in Lo where he says, "Now and then admirers of my good works write to me and try to convert me into believing things that I say." So there's a little bit of Robert Anton Wilson there. Come to think of it, I really do think that he took his ideas seriously, but again, he did have some kind of skepticism about a lot of what he wrote. You could say that he lived a somewhat monastic existence. I wouldn't say that he was a weirdo, although he did do some very interesting things. He was fond of combining canned food. Specifically, he came up with something called topicho, which was a combination of tomatoes and peaches. And he also came up with something else called topruno, which, yeah, you guessed it, those are tomatoes and prunes. He also invented a game called Super Checkers. Anyways, you can go through all of that in his biography should you wish to read it. He was a kind man, very studious in his research, always. Inwardly, though, he was filled with a ton of doubt. I think his father is pretty much responsible for this, just beat doubt into him, and so many expectations that he could never live up to. He doesn't paint a very pretty picture of himself. I think he was beaten by life like quite a bit, and I think he was also perplexed by modernity in some way. He knew that he had important things to say, but he perhaps didn't have the gumption to say them as loud as others would be able to. I identify with Charles on many levels, specifically when he was younger. He seemed like a very sweet bear of a man, large, but also large in heart, quiet, but he was anxious of the time that he lived, but he was indeed a man of his time. In as many words, I love Charles Fort. I think he was a very swell guy. I don't think there's much more you can say than that. So for the remainder of this podcast, I'm going to split it into two parts. One part is going to be certainly longer than the other, but here are the two parts. What is Charles Fort known for, and what he should be known for? So let's start with the first one. What is he known for? Charles has his own word, Fortean, or Fortiana, which means, anything odd, supernatural, paranormal. Such things as, here we go, I think I got this from Wikipedia. He would report events including teleportation, a term Fort is generally credited with inventing, falls of frogs, fishes, and inorganic materials like limestone, spontaneous human combustion, ball lightning, a term explicitly used by Fort, poltergeist events, unaccountable noises and explosions, levitation, unidentified flying objects, unexplained disappearances, giant wheels of light in the oceans, and animals found outside of their normal ranges, like phantom cats. He offered many reports of out-of-place artifacts and strange items found in unlikely locations. And he was one of the first people to explain disappearances that might, to our eyes, look a lot like alien abduction. I actually told a friend of mine that I was going to be doing a show on Charles Fort, and she asked, do you call yourself a Fortian? Are you a Fortian? And I said, I guess. I don't really know what Fortian is. There's a lot of debate as to what being a Fortian is. I think at bottom it's just agnostic skepticism about paranormal and supernatural phenomena, not unlike that of Robert Anton Wilson, who was a big fan of Charles Fort. But just collecting and researching the weird with a somewhat skeptical eye. In 1931, a year before Charles passed away, the Fortean Society was formed. Fort refused to lead this in any way, shape, or form. And in fact, the inaugural meeting of the Fortean Society, he had to be tricked. I think they gave him some false telegrams. So he showed up there and he had no idea why he was there. And they were like, welcome to the first meeting. So that just speaks to the kind of person Fort was. In 1973, a magazine called the Fortean Times was started. I'm not sure if he would have been a fan of this. I'm just going to put it that way. Most people that are involved, maybe not most people, but a lot of people involved in it are true believers of this phenomenon, and that they hope that it will all be explained one day somehow. Others that are involved in the Fortean Times, they remain merely curious about Fortean phenomena, such as the supernatural and the paranormal. Here's the thing. Chuck hated these words. He did not like them, supernatural and paranormal. He was not interested in them in the least. In fact, on the word supernatural, Charles has this to say: "It has no place in my vocabulary. In my view, it has no meaning or distinguishment. If there ever has been, finally, a natural explanation of anything, everything is supernatural." So that's straight from the horse's mouth there. Or the walrus's mouth, I guess you'll say. He had a really kick-ass mustache, I have to say. So to Charles, nothing was natural, strangely enough. And this might seem a lot like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but there's something special here. He was convinced that while interesting, comparatively to what science dictates as natural, his notes show that this kind of thing happens all the time. The word paranormal also just kind of gets chucked aside. What beside the normal? What? He once was remarked as saying, "I cannot say that truth is stranger than fiction because I have not had acquaintance with either." So that's just it. There is a humility of contact with the strange for Charles, and that the strange really isn't that strange at all. He thought that newspapers should be participating in broadcasting the phenomena that he was interested in, not for shits and giggles like we do now, or hey, look at this weird shit, but a part of the human experience, part of this awesome world, not shuffled away into a category of look at this weirdness, but isn't it all interesting, this experience? He also wasn't a fan of all of this kind of stuff being explained away as a delusion and or lies. Charles Fort knew that it was real somehow, or at least becoming real. When he started to engage with it, and he did, there's a story of him I think just trying to do something strange, and he would stare at a small picture that was on his wall, and I guess through some kind of like psychokinesis, he wanted something to happen to it, and it eventually just it fell off the wall, and it startled the hell out of him. So yeah. Instead, all of this information, it just kind of stays relegated to this day. It's been given a place. It's Fortean, right? It's just over there. So many want to keep it there, both skeptics and believers. It's easier that way, right? Just keep the extraordinary just that, extraordinary. But Chuck wanted it to burst out of these confines. He was talking about this phenomena would seem as natural as talking about the weather for Charles. This is what he wanted. And I think we have a long way to go before we do. Or do we? Thing is, and this is indeed a theme of this show, so forgive me, this is the broken record. It's not about the what. It should be about the how. And by that, with Charles Fort, the what of Charles Fort is the details of the strange experiences, which take up a great portion of his books. Not so much the how of Charles Fort. And the how is Charles Fort's comparativism. It's not a mistake. People are not mistaking Charles Fort when they concentrate on the details of his research into strange paranormal and supernatural phenomena. That's not a mistake. But it's just a very surface level understanding of Charles Fort's work. Which leads me into Charles Fort and what he should be known for. So for this last section here, most of my info comes from people like Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, Dr. Jack Hunter, Amba J. Seppi, Gordon White, and Colin Bennett, who have talked about Charles Fort quite a bit. So we're going to start with a little story here. Let's talk about peaches. Now, of course, Charles's father was a grocer, and Charles Fort had to work when he was younger as a boy in his father's grocery store. What they would do is that they would buy from other stores cans of tinned food, normally fruit or vegetables, and they would take the labels off and then put their own labels on those cans and mark up the price because that's just what you do back in the day. And Charles would be working in the store and he would be putting the labels on, and eventually one day he found that he was out of labels for certain items such as like succotash or string beans, but what he did have were tons of labels for canned peaches. So he just started putting these peach labels on cans that certainly did not have peaches on them. To quote Charles Fort, here's what he had to say about it. I pasted the peach labels on the peach cans and then came to apricots. Well, aren't apricots peaches? I went on, mischievously or scientifically, pasting the peach labels on cans of plums, cherries, string beans, and succotash. I can't quite define my motive because to this day it has not been decided whether I'm a humorist or a scientist. Now this is funny for Charles for several reasons. I mean, he's not merely a trickster, but this meant something to Charles. At least it meant enough for him to be able to talk about it. And I think it speaks quite a bit on something like labels and how we rely on labels to be absolute truth. Not just labels on cans of food, but labels for existence, how we have a nice category or a place for absolutely everything. Speaking on this story in Authors of the Impossible by Jeffrey Kripal, this is what he has to say. The moral of this parable is two-edged and remarkably nuanced. On one level, it appears to suggest that our classification schemes are more or less useful and more or less deceitful and more or less profitable, but they certainly do not accurately reflect the true nature of things. We sell someone else's goods and pretend they are ours. On another level, the parable appears to be suggesting something a bit deeper, namely, that even the real nature of things does not reflect the real nature of things. What appears to be plums, or cherries, or succotash, is really all peaches. The deceitful label is true, the fraud is fact. Everything is one thing. So sometimes we too can be tricked. And it just depends on who has the labels. Is Fort's phenomena, are these the tricks? Are these something else with a different label on it? And also, who has the labels? This all depends on where the labels come from. Right now, that's science and naturalism. So the comparative method of Charles Fort. So Fort knew that current knowledge in his day and ours arises out of how one collects and classifies data. Right now, those labels are that of explanation, or one could say evidence. To us, this seems like the only way one gets to the truth, to the reality of existence. Fort had a very different take. He knew that modern science excludes things from its comparative schema so that everything fits, everything can be explained and documented. To Charles Fort, and he knew this well, the scientific and natural reality that we have now excludes more than it includes. Fort called anomalies like the phenomena that he researched and documented damned facts. In fact, he hated the word anomaly because anomaly implies that something is wrong. And to science, this stuff is wrong. Therefore, it doesn't fit. Therefore, it is excluded. To Charles, no picture of reality is complete without taking these damn facts into account. It doesn't mean that they have to be explained. Chances are a lot of this phenomena cannot be explained. Fort wanted to privilege these damned facts, ones disregarded by science and religion. He thought that this would give us a better picture of reality, a more inclusive and expansive one closer to the truth, perhaps. And this requires from all of us a bravery, not merely a curiosity, to include these things that have been chucked out in our current model. How does one do that? Speaking as the foe of science, Fort realized that exclusion was harmful to us as a people and as a society, that scientists are not responsible for our reality. They can inform it, certainly, but there is far too much of our experience that they cannot account for. This area, the excluded, this was Charles' playground. Not the details of what he encountered, but how to sit with them. Another idea that I think Charles needs to get a bit more credit for is something called Intermediatism. Now, Charles Fort was a monist, which means that he did think that everything was one thing. All existence was one major thing. It's a pretty holistic view of the cosmos and reality. Things exist as part of some sort of one. Your dreams, coincidences, experiences were hints of this oneness. How does that come to be? For Charles Fort, he had Intermediatism. Everything was on a spectrum, the objective and the subjective, or for Charles, all phenomena were approximations in one way between realness and unrealness. I'm going to read here a little bit from a book called Damned Facts, 14 Essays on Religion, Folklore, and the Paranormal, which was edited by Dr. Jack Hunter. By approaching all phenomena as equally real/unreal, from the commonplace and everyday to the most exceptional and far out, Fort was essentially proposing a monistic metaphysics, according to which all events, all in their varied manifestations, are, in some sense, fundamentally connected to one another. All are part of the same process of becoming real, of moving towards positiveness, and all give equal insight into the underlying oneness. Fort suggests that this oneness might be best thought of as a living system, perhaps as a cosmic organism, maybe even possessing some form of purposive intelligence and agency. Indeed, he did talk about things called the Super Sargasso Sea, again, that realm or dimension that strange things can manifest and fall to Earth, or some kind of miasma that covers the Earth and the sky. But again, this was part of the one for Charles. All things are in a process of becoming real. All things are expressions of the underlying oneness to Charles. I mean, he nearly gets to animism in a way, nearly. I think these days he probably would have been one, but the idea of the universe as an organism, and also that all things are an expression of its own interiority and agency, I think would have been an idea that Charles could have gotten behind. Yet things like ghosts or ball lightning or UFO starships are to be privileged, as we are in a process of seeing that these things become real somehow. Now, I'm a huge fan of this. Again, I think that objective and subjective exist on a spectrum, and yes, Charles Fort, he really gets this, which is great for me, because again, it seems like it is part of a story. The universe in some way has a narrative. I think also Charles would have been really big on the idea of dual aspect monism, which is the idea that mind and matter are actually one thing. They're not separate the way that Cartesian dualism has it, that they are one strange thing. Mind and matter are one, but somehow they split off in some way, and perhaps human beings are the splitters through our consciousness. Charles, however, might have had other ideas about this. I want to talk a bit about the dark mythology of Charles Fort. So, a lot of people that write about Charles Fort, specifically about the things that he documented, will go out of their way to say something like, Charles Fort is a man who realized that these things are a mirror, that UFOs, Bigfoot, all this phenomena is a mirror of us, which I think in a way relativizes a lot of Charles's work. It's not that they're wrong, but I say yes. But what kind of mirror? And you bet, it is a two-way mirror. And I don't think people go this extra step to ask what kind of mirror Charles Fort's work actually is. There is something on the other side of that mirror. Remember, two-way mirrors can allow you to both from one side be able to see yourself, so you're seeing a reflection, and then from the other side, it is something that can see through. It is transparent. What it is that's on the other side of that mirror, we do not know yet. Charles had his own ideas. Now, a lot has been made of this, and I think if you're interested, please look it up. But here's what Charles thought. Would we, if we could, educate and sophisticate pigs, geese, cattle? Would it be wise to establish diplomatic relations with the hen that now functions, satisfied with the mere sense of achievement by way of compensation? I think we're property. So, Charles thinks that we're cattle in some way. But who runs the farm? I do think that Charles was very serious about this. Somehow, things are being written out for us. We are part of a story, and as a writer, this fascinated Fort in some way. But instead of seeing joy at this, he was concerned, I think. Charles was not sure if the other side of the mirror had our interests at heart. Now, a lot of what Charles wrote, it was at the very tail end of colonialism, so it was in the air, but Charles cut through it. He saw somehow that what weaves reality seemed to have some kind of agency to it. He wasn't dismayed by it, but he played with it a little bit. Perhaps what seemed malevolent to us was actually beneficial in some way. On this, Charles had this to say. I think that there are, out in interplanetary space, super Tamerlanes at the head of hosts of celestial ravagers. I should say that we're now under cultivation, that we're conscious of it, but we have the impertinence to attribute it all down to our own nobler and higher instincts. In a way, Charles is a bit Gnostic, and I'm sure that he would probably consider this to be Gnostic in some way. This idea, of course, is not a very new concept, but he seemed to have presaged in some way things like alien abductions or the kind of phenomena that others, such as John E. Mack and Whitley Strieber, talk about. Fort knew about the other side of the mirror, but it perplexed him as much as it does us now. And lastly here, we're going to talk about my favorite thing that Charles Fort came up with. And they are called dominants. That's dominant with a T, not dominance. Dominant. So I'm not sure if people are aware of paradigms. In a way, Fraser's The Golden Bough goes through it, how we started off with magical thinking and magic, and we eventually moved to religion, and then we eventually moved to science, and how science is now like the pinnacle, the achievement. We've arrived at science, so now we have the best way of validating truth. Thomas Kuhn also wrote about paradigms, and it's from him that we get the idea of paradigms in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is mainly just about science and how science has things that it thinks are true, and then eventually some other data comes in, and then we have to change everything, and so we have a brand new paradigm. 40 years before Thomas Kuhn, Charles Fort came up with the idea of dominance. Dominants are a way a society or culture gets its epistemology and therefore its ontology. The best way of putting it is that all phenomena are explained in the terms of the dominant of their era. This is why we give up trying to explain and content ourselves with expressing. Charles Fort listed 3 of them. The first one, he said, was the dominant of religion, and then eventually that moved into the dominant of science, so kind of golden bough-ish. But Charles had no love for either of these, specifically almost zero love for religion. He had this to say: religion is a belief in a supreme being. Science is belief in a supreme generalization. Essentially, they are the same. Both are suppressors of witchcraft, and I shall take up these oppositions together. But in a state of realness-unrealness, there cannot be real opposition. In our existence of the hyphen, what is called opposition is only one view of the state of opposition stimulation. There is no way of judging anything except by its manifestations. Just as much as it has been light, religion has been darkness. Today it is twilight. In the past, it was mercy and charity and persecution and bloody maniacal sadistic hatred, hymns from chapels and screams from the holy slaughterhouses, aspirations going up from this earth with smoke from burning bodies. I can say that from religion we have never had opposition, because there never has been religion. We have never had opposition, because that this religion has never existed, as apart from all other virtues and vices and blessings and scourges, that like all other alleged things, beings, or institutions, religion never has, in a final sense, had identity. Okay, so what? Some of you might be saying. Eventually, things like UFOs and ghosts will be explained in this new dominant, so that's not entirely right. Not entirely. Fort goes further. It is not solely what gets included in the new dominant, but how it gets included, how we know. It becomes epistemological. So with religion, that was the epistemology of belief. Science, it was empirical evidence. This new dominant, well, who knows? Could be intermediatism, could be experience, could be open curiosity, where everything is possible, a kind of possibilianism in some way. The dominant of wider inclusions is not the end, of course. Charles has this to say about dominance. In our acceptance, dominants in their succession displace preceding dominants not only because they are more nearly positive, but because the old dominants, as recruiting mediums, play out. So the dominant of wider inclusions is not the end, of course. It too will play out, and a new one will take its place. This next dominant is more beneficial than the last dominant, as it includes more in its epistemology and excludes less. But again, everything is in a process of becoming real, so things constantly change. I know that right now it might seem unfathomable that something comes after science, after the need to categorize and explain everything. This is what Kuhn and Fraser saw science as the end point, and then from here science just stays and all darkness falls away and we only have constant illumination via science. But it is not. Any model which is based solely on what it does not allow, then what it does allow is doomed to fail or falter ultimately. We know this. So where does this all lead? Of course, there is more to Charles Fort. These things are my favorite: the dominance, intermediatism, his dark mythology, and his comparative method. I hope people can see that by concentrating on collecting of weird things in order to someday explain them so that it fits in this dominant is a fool's errand. Some things will not be explained, which was never the point ultimately. The point is to include them. Fort called these things damned data or damned facts, as they are the phenomena that is the poison in this machine world dominant that we have created. They haven't been explained away. They still happen as much as they'd like us to think that they don't. But what we are seeing now, that sentiment I started the show with, this unease that we are feeling now, these are birth pains of this new dominant, the dominant of wider inclusions. Fort is championed by a hero of mine, Dr. Jeffrey Kripal, who wrote Authors of the Impossible, the greatest thing written about Fort ever. 8 years later, he wrote of a scenario which we start to include these damned experiences, when scientists start to talk about the strange things that have happened to them, not on an individual basis, but as a collective, when scientists start to include. To him, this is called The Flip, which is a book that I think everybody should read. Make no mistake, whether you believe in this stuff or not, either way, it doesn't matter, it's happening constantly. So what can you do? Do as Fort did. Privilege the damned. There are damned facts about everything you were told to believe is true. Everything that is important to us now. There is a scaffolding of our reality that has spots and spaces where the damned is somewhat easy to spot. Concentrate on these. Stick with them. Learn more of them. Do not try and pull them into this current dominant, as this one is on its last legs. And don't take the damned to be the only part of reality, whereby you inflate the damned to a fever dream of reality itself, like so many people that get wrapped up in really shitty conspiratorial thinking. Most of the time, the damned facts are part of the story, not the entire story. The new dominant can't advocate for itself yet, but it's getting there. While you continue to stay with the damned, keep doing magic, witchcraft, astrology, all of it. Remember when things get real weird in the past. Recognize when things get real weird now, because they are going to happen more, trust me. Leave behind the idea that you have to drag the fissures of the next dominant into this one. You don't need to explain everything, just experience it as it is. That's more than enough, and share it if you really want to. Because we are the damned. We know about spirits. We know magic works. We know the stars and the planets have an agency in our lives and that they are us, infinite and important. We know there's another side of the mirror and something awaits on the other side. Keep this up. Things are in a process of becoming and unbecoming, real and unreal. Nothing may be true going forward. It may just all be on a spectrum. I can't think of anything more terrifying. Stay with this terror. The damned will march. They will march. Let's march with them. So for those interested, head to whatmagicisthis.com. There you're going to be able to find a way to subscribe to my podcast, whether it be on iTunes or Spotify or any of the podcatchers that you have. I'm pretty much listed on all of them. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, there you'll find a way to be able to find my Twitter account, my Facebook account, and my Instagram account. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, there you will find show notes for each and every show that I do. I go out of my way for some show notes. There'll be some interesting ones here, mostly about books that you can find. There's actually not a ton of information about Charles Fort on the internet, but I will have a link to his unpublished autobiography, which is actually worth a read. If you enjoy this show, please leave a review on iTunes or Stitcher or any of the places that allow you to leave a review. I know everybody likes the whole star clicky thing, but if you want to write a few words about me, again, it's all a story. Words matter. So if you could write a little story about my podcast, specifically about how much you love it, that would be greatly appreciated. If you enjoy the show, please tell a friend. Chances are if they're a weirdo Fortian like myself, then they might enjoy this program as well. Not too long ago, I started a Patreon account. I just want to take a second here because it's getting a bit more popular, and I would love for you to join me. It's only $7 a month. That's almost nothing. That's a couple of coffees in this day and age. I know things are a little bit weird right now, but I do a ton of work on this podcast. Up on my Patreon, there's interesting exclusive content. I just recently put up a video. It was 23 minutes long about setting up an ancestral altar. That's there on Patreon. It's a good video. It's not just like a one-shot me talking into a microphone. I actually go through setting up an ancestral altar. So it's really quite cool, and people are loving it there on Patreon as well. This month we're going to have some extra content. It's all going to be great. So come join me on Patreon. If you go to whatmagicisthis.com, there's a couple of buttons you can click and it'll take you straight there. I would love to see you there, and I'd love for you to be a luminous friend. Come and show your support. It would be greatly appreciated. If you're not about the whole Patreon thing, but you enjoyed this episode as much as, say, a video rental back in the day, I've got a PayPal me button on whatmagicisthis.com. Just click on it. You can send me a couple of bucks from, I don't know, $5 to $500 to $500,000, whatever you feel like. Any and all contributions are incredibly appreciated. So yeah, that's it. So I'm driving in a bit of a stake with this show. The rest of the year's programs, they're going to be a procession of the damned in some way. I'm excited for you, for me, and for whatever lies ahead for the rest of the year. So thank you so much for listening, everybody. You've been listening to What Magic Is This? My name is Douglas Batchelor. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay damned. We'll talk at you soon. Bye-bye.